Can you hear? Good enough?
Don't kill the apple.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So this is a period that we set aside to I think the accurate word is entertain. Entertain ourselves and also address questions and issues, suggestions that you might have regarding the practice. So the ball's in your court. If you would care to play, just raise your hand and we'll. Yeah, Peter.
Which one?
Oh yeah, you have to wait till you have authorization to speak.
Yeah, we're very formal now. It's a kind.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks. It's so good to be back sitting with all of you.
Really?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've noticed, for example, I want to talk about the maybe what seems like the transition from Tibetan to English. I remember on several occasions you discussing that or saying that Tibetan was important to use because of its sanctity, because of so many beings having achieved, great realization by practicing in that language. And I notice now it's, that there seems to be less Tibetan, more English. And even when Rinpoche was here, he was reciting along with us in English. And, I'm just wondering if you could talk about that somewhat, about what's happening. I can imagine these high-level meetings back in India going like, all right, how are we going to get this English thing going, or what's our strategy here, or whatever, right?
Well, if that's a question, it's directed to the wrong person. But of course, what you are witnessing is there. There is change happening. So that change is not new. It's just fresh. And I think that the way we used to talk about Tibetan, we still talk about Tibetan in similar ways, because there is something to be said there for the language that the Dharma grew up in, and that we inherited it at that level. In conversations with both Bokha Rinpoche and more recently with Khenpo Rinpoche, I suspect I'm not the only one who had conversations with him around this transition from the use of Tibetan to kind of, let's say, somewhat passively accepting the use of English, and then maybe a little bit more enthusiastic about it. So I think that's just a natural evolution of things. And much could be said about the value of Tibetan and learning Tibetan, the nuances in the language that it's been in for so many centuries are not easy to capture in English. On the other hand, the communities, including this one, who are paying more attention to their practice, whether it's in English or Tibetan, their understanding of the Dharma getting deeper and more, again, more nuanced and more clear and broad in its perspective, I think also gives people like Khenpo Rinpoche a sense of confidence that we're moving in the right direction. And so then we end up with things like we had when he was here, which was quite remarkable when we recited things in English, and even when we recited things that were transliterated into Tibetan, which used to also be, quite a while ago, even that was considered like compromise. And now it feels like it's more more okay. And even beyond the okay is that things are actually good.
Thank you.
Bill, do you want to add something to that, since you're
The only thing that I would add is to reiterate one little piece where you talked about the nuances that are more readily understood by those who speak Tibetan about the Dharma than when we translate the terms directly. Just simple terms like the word that's usually translated as thought, which in the Tibetan, the understanding is this is basically anything that arises in experience that's tinged by the perspective of self and other. Namtok ngoro chukra sungpajin. So just the So yeah, we say thought, but the underlying implications in the term in Tibetan are much. We have some work to do to kind of figure out how we're all going to say a certain word in English, and then all nod in understanding to say, oh yes, this is we're referring to something that has this range and depth of meaning. So that takes some time. And language is a funny shorthand in any case. So it's always going to be imprecise, no matter which language it is. So from that perspective, the Tibetan isn't necessarily more sacred and wonderful than anything else, but we have some work to do. But it's actually very interesting. It's a very interesting opportunity, instead of just kind of placing our mental gears sort of almost in neutral as we speak, and just the words kind of fall out without any kind of challenge to our own understanding about what we're saying or what we're hearing. When we think there's something more to be understood in a word, it challenges us. You have to wake up a little bit to be present with the conversation and to look deeper in and inquire more deeply. So I think that was one of the things very early on, sitting with Lama Tinley, whose English was he thought he was saying temporary, but he was saying temperature. My English very temperature. So just to try to get a grasp on when something was translated as clarity, exactly what was that? And to start from the perspective, I had absolutely no idea what he thought it was, and what. So we were kind of going back and forth. Is it like this? Is it like that? It's like, oh. So.
May I just note one other thing, which is the exceptional gift of having someone like Lama Erik as a translator. My sense is it was more like a transmission. You felt like you were listening. It was like this magical thing that was happening, and you were just listening to Rinpoche. It was wonderful. And he, of course, noted as well that questions about words, and he said, "Well, we're going to have to talk about that. We're going to have to try to work. There may be better ways of." So anyway, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, Lama Michael,
I see you.
Okay, I see you too. To more on that, I'm remembering when you came to Green Tara practice 2 times ago, and you were talking about, you were commenting on what you noticed when all of us were at the empowerment chanting in Tibetan and not knowing what we were saying, and how we can access something different. And to me, the way I think of it is, if I'm saying words, it's like a sound meditation. It's like music. I don't know what they're saying, but there's an experience. It's like looking at abstract art rather than representational. It seems that sometimes using Tibetan, when we only get a word here and there, and we're only getting part of that word, like thought, it opens something and lets us go beyond what we think that we're aware of knowing. Just like when we imagine ourselves as Chenrezig, it's I'm quoting Boka Rinpoche saying, well, just who do you think you are? You know, just as in getting past what we think we are. And so it seems like that might be one of the uses to chant in Tibetan and in English, and then maybe in Tibetan again, so we can expand our. Can you talk on that?
Not so much, but I think, and I have some confidence in this for a number of reasons, that that the Tibetan and the English are informing each other to some degree, and those of us who know neither English nor Tibetan, for example, are also being informed, and we're informing. So there's a kind of growth that is happening, and I reference one event that a number of people who were there are here today, where Khenpo Tsultrim, who is highly revered, and was also known for being quite, I don't want to say strict, but he would have at some point said, really, you really need to learn Tibetan in order to understand the Dharma. But at a certain event that we were having here in Portland, he actually, I guess, picked the moment that was the most earth-shaking. He said that if you do not recite the liturgies in English, English will never become a sacred language. And that was kind of shocking to a number of us, not in the sense of resistance to it, but just like we just didn't hear those things. So I think many of us felt like that's true before we ever heard it, of course, because the Tibetan is not also the original language that the Dharma was in. So they had to also come to this place of, and we saw it after it happened, that they translated things into Tibetan and dealt with all of the nuances that maybe weren't quite right and changed over time. So I think we all had a certain feeling like that has to happen. But who makes it happen? Who decides? And who determines that a particular translation is accurate or not accurate? Those are all very kind of interesting things. So when Khenpo Tsultrim, who had the ability, the confidence to say it, and also the reputation for saying it when he said, if you don't recite it in English also, he didn't say just now we're going to switch. He just said, if you refuse to recite it in English, if you did that successfully, the English language would never become a sacred language. So I think we're still in the middle of that. You should check back in a century. Yeah. I think it's true, because it isn't just the language, it's the realization behind it. If we don't get the realization and all we got was what we thought was an accurate conceptual translation, we wouldn't have gotten very far. All those things have to come together. So get on it. Yeah. Whoa, you're fast.
Hi. I think my question's pretty basic, but something that I've been curious about for a while is if there are any writings about the human experience of going through retreat. Like, week 1, I thought I had it, and then, a year in, this is the way my brain was working, and I really felt like I understood this and that. Just like, almost like a journal or a memoir or a telling, because I have no idea if it's something that's ever going to come through my lifetime to go on a retreat, and I'm curious literally what the human experience of that
Would you
is like.
repeat that last part again? I didn't quite catch that.
Just that I'm not sure that my life will ever have a 3-year retreat in it, and I'm curious what the
I see.
human experience of a retreat is. So I'm wondering if someone, I'm probably not the only person who's curious, and every person who's been through a retreat doesn't want to tell the story a million times. So I'm curious if someone's written or told the story in some way that I could listen to or read.
Well, of course, there's things that people have written.
Yeah.
but I would not necessarily overly mystify or specialize a retreat of any particular length. So a 3-year retreat has a certain purpose and structure to it, and for, of course, we hope that anyone who does a long retreat of that duration and intensity, that it's good and that it works and is helpful for them and then for others by extension. But it doesn't necessarily mean, and I think many people have pointed this out, that any particular approach cannot be said to be the way to get from where we are, the confused state, let's say, to the place where we're not confused. You cannot rely upon a long retreat to dispel that confusion. And there's a certain way in which we have to say each person really does find their own way through it. And there are many things that we take into account. For example, it's helpful if you have a qualified teacher who guides you in certain ways. And what that person's role is also not entirely codified. So it depends upon the students, it depends upon the teacher, it depends upon the abilities of both of them, and it depends upon the other people who are engaged in a long retreat. So many things there that when I say those things, I wonder who would actually be able to write something down which had a sense of universality about it, as opposed to just my personal experience, which we also could say in every case is just your personal experience. And so maybe because of that, maybe that sentiment that I'm mentioning is shared a little bit. I don't see very many books like that.
There's Cave in the Snow.
Yeah.
That's one. But just her circumstance was quite unique in terms of actually a cave literally in the snow, or the title actually more appropriately could be the cave that got buried by an avalanche and I had to dig my way out as part of my retreat. So that's probably not going. You're not going to repeat that. So I mean, you could try, but you'd have to work at it a bit. Yes. Cave, frequent avalanches. Yeah, it's probably not in the Craigslist. But there are other books, but it is very it is exactly a personal experience. Otherwise, it would not be. There'd be no point in it. So, what was the? You thought of another book?
Well, I can't remember the name of it. I don't know if anybody read this. It was actually in the Zen tradition, an American woman who went and spent intensive time in Zen monasteries, and she became very highly regarded in their tradition, and she died a young, tragic death in a vehicular accident soon after, being considered like, wow, she really achieved a lot. Anyway, I could maybe dig that up, but I thought that was actually an amazing book, I guess, but quite interesting. Do you know it?
I don't know that one, but the Reverend G.U. Kennett, who founded Shasta Abbey, which is Shasta, California, also went to Japan, and she wrote quite a detailed memoir of that called The Wild White Swan. It's pretty amazing. But I want to say, just assume that a human goes through everything there. Just assume that. Just as you go through in a microcosm your Dharma practice. It's hard, it's blissful, it's boring, it's great. It's just that extended over many more moments. Really. Yeah. So then you already know what that would be like in a certain way.
Hello, my name is Camilo. This is my third week here. I've been to the evening sessions the last 2 weeks. And I've had a question each time. First time was about the expectancy of experiencing Buddha nature. And the second question was about whether yearning for realization is an aspect of desire. And I think these questions have been leading up to the one that's on my mind now. And it came to me last night after watching a film, Swept Away, Lena Wertmüller's film. And that film deals with passion, emotions, but in the film there are many transitions in these experiences of feeling. And it started me thinking about Buddhist teaching about emotion. And this morning I looked at what makes you not a Buddhist, and it's very clear that emotion is something which is a part of what we're trying to somehow deal with in our practice. And I have doubts about what Buddhist teaching about emotions is, because emotions are hardwired, part of our essence. We speak about sentient beings. Sentient means feeling as well as perceiving. So I just am curious to get a little direction in how to go about appreciating how Buddhism deals with emotion.
That'd be easier, actually. Yeah. I was thinking while you were speaking that you were going to come to some kind of a conclusion, which you didn't, about perhaps that Buddhism had as a goal to be free of emotion. So I'm hoping that you don't have that understanding, as it would be considered a misunderstanding. Emotion actually is, we could say just generally, might first say that it's a certain kind of feeling, experience. And I don't think that we can effectively meditate without experience. And almost by definition, we could say that all experience is in that same category. We could call it all emotion if we wanted to, but we don't call everything anger or everything happy and pleasurable. We make those distinctions. But emotion is powerful. And without a strong emotion of some kind, it's very difficult to see what we need to see in our meditation. So the emotion is powerful and helpful if one knows how to use it. Kind of like you have a can of gasoline to put in your car, you need to know where to put it in the car in order for it to accomplish what you want it to do. So we have many situations in our lives when we have emotional experiences, and we could divide these things into two categories, though I've never seen it done, but in my own sense of it, in a very broad kind of coarse way, I would say that emotion, strong emotion especially, can be extremely helpful if you can see that experience in the moment without attachment, where you just see the experience very clearly. That is not so easy to do. And the conundrum in it is that if the emotion is weak, then it's kind of like you need to go across town, but you've only got 1 tablespoon of gasoline, so it won't get you there. You need to have enough so that you can actually make the journey. And I think that's a piece of why we do strong practices sometimes, because it naturally raises strong experiences. If everything is kind of flat, there isn't much to see. So you want to accomplish this thing of recognizing the nature of mind itself, but the experience of seeing that, according to all of the texts and the teachings, is actually an extraordinarily powerful experience. So if everything is kind of flat, the likelihood that you'll see that thing is not very high. So we tend to suffer as meditators by wanting to be rid of difficult emotions. And in the process, if we're successful, unfortunately, we're actually putting aside, in many cases, the very thing that could have been very useful. So you have to add one caveat to that, and that is that if within our practice we're still quite young, kind of like you wouldn't give a can of gasoline to a 12-year-old with matches, even though they might enjoy the result. So we also need to take into account, as we mature in our meditation and our practice and our understanding, that there are certain things that happen in a certain order. And if the prerequisites are not in place, then the thing that you're looking for or the thing that you've read about should happen is not likely to happen. And that, of course, is where we get into the value of personal relationships with teachers and with Sangha members, community members, sharing their experiences and their understanding so that there can be a gradual increase in our understanding and our experience that's helpful. Let's see, I think I did that in 27 seconds, didn't I?
That's very helpful, because I think the problem that I was having with the concept is that on the one hand we have emotion which we are counseled to be aware of.
Yeah.
And I think in the way that you describe it as experience, it helps bring together the feeling along with the awareness. Thank you.
Lama Michael, am I not on? Just not in.
Yeah, you just have to talk.
I
to
noticed during shamatha practice today that I focus on the in-breath and I focus on the out-breath. I pay attention there. And then after the out-breath, there's this space, a second, second and a half, 2 seconds before the next in-breath. And I started to feel like that's really kind of a precious little opportunity there. It's a little free fall space there where I'm not focused anymore, but nothing else has come in either. I just wonder, is that something to work with?
Well, of course. Next. There is in the shamatha practice of following the breath, this is always there. In other words, there's an end to an inhale and there's an end to an exhale, and at both of those ends, there's a kind of a moment there where if one intends to and pays attention, there's a moment where you have the opportunity for a little insight. So the insight might be not very big, and so we miss it. In other words, we might just write it off as, well, that's just what breathing looks like. You breathe in and you breathe out. You breathe in and you breathe out. But there's some benefit in recognizing the subtlety of when you put your awareness on the breath and you follow it out and you follow it in. And there's some practices where you count those breaths in a certain way and relate to them at the point where you've exhaled and you're about to begin the inhalation, so that you're paying a kind of attention to that also. So I'm not sure what else you're looking for there, but I think that one of the things that many of us appreciate about our Buddhist practice is that it's meant to embrace virtually every experience that you could possibly have in some way, kind of like food that's digested. You're meant to digest all the food, and this is in a way like food for the meditation. Everything that we do, everything that we experience, whether it's the experience, I'm having an experience right now, I'm speaking, so I hear that, and I have a reaction to it, which may be positive or negative. If I notice that reaction, everything changes in the moment. My speech changes, what I'm about to say, everything changes. If I notice that change, something more happens in terms of just the awareness of what's happening. Changes along. And in the short term and the long term, I would say what's really helpful is the awareness. you recognize the experience as it unfolds. So,
And we say, I will now practice calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. And I wonder if that space could be a space of bodhichitta, where...
Well, what you just said is that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, yeah. But what does that... Maybe a space where we're all there doing shamatha.
I'm not sure what you mean by we're.
Nor am I.
Now, wait a minute. That's not like
I'll work on it.
There is I think there's an interesting point to be made here regarding bodhicitta. So for those who are not clear about the bodhicitta is fundamentally the aspiration, which is really critical in this practice, to direct our energies towards the benefit of all sentient beings. Now, I can say from my own experience that has, from time to time, been so dry that it's like powder in the desert. You wonder, like, why would I be doing this? I don't get it. And I think it's dry when we are not doing it properly, when it isn't quite right. So it really should be, and sometimes it's characterized by this technically, it should be warm and moist, like life itself. It should be warm and moist. So when it gets dry, it's because maybe we're just following the schedule. In other words, you do this and then you do that. You follow the breath when it comes in, when it comes to the end of the inhale, then you just let go of it and relax in that place. And then you do this and that and put all the pieces together. It can be really wonderful at some point, and then because you repeat it verbatim, like you read the same instruction out of the text over and over, it ends up being dry. So my antidote to that for myself is this. It is not possible to accomplish your own benefit. Full stop. And then the first time that came to mind, I thought, is that the case? And I'm not sure that it's 100% the case, but let's admit what is clear. Almost everybody, I think we could say everybody, but I'd like to be slightly generous. Almost everybody, when we sit down to meditate, is hoping that I benefit from my meditation. I should at least be less attached. I should be less angry with my friends. I should be less cynical about the world. It's like I'm trying to do something good here, but behind that is also the thing of, wait a minute here, I'm not feeling any better at the end of the session. So what's wrong with my meditation? And I think the answer to that is that the bodhicitta is meant to be the practice that undermines our attachment, gives rise to great equanimity, loving kindness and compassion, all this stuff. And meanwhile, we're undermining it by trying to engage in this practice so that I can be somehow improved. Now that's a laudable goal, to improve oneself. But the problem is the self always gets in the way. And it's not even helpful when you read a compelling text that convinces you there actually isn't anything that we call a self. That's just an illusion. That doesn't help either. That's just disappointing. And so I come to the conclusion, you cannot benefit yourself. It's kind of like if you want to climb up something, you have to have a rope. You can't just like grasp at the air. You don't go anywhere. So you have to get a rope or a pole or something. And the analogy that I come to is the bodhichitta is that thing. Give up the benefit for yourself. Just abandon it 100% and do not think that this makes it a martyr program, because that's just going to undermine everything. So you need to really be interested in doing it, and you need to understand that you cannot yourself bring about your own happiness. Though you may feel happy for a moment, it's most likely because you were focusing on the benefit of others. That's the key. You put your focus on the benefit of others, abandon your own sense of like, whether you say it to yourself or not, like what I'm really looking for is the benefit that I can experience, that I can measure, that I can know that I'm doing it right, all these things. And those things are not necessarily bad, but the reliance on that undermines where the real power is, that your effort goes to the benefit of others. Your wish, your effort, your practice in its totality is for the benefit of others. So you rely upon the other's happiness, and your happiness rides on that. I can't think of a better way to say it, but I'm sure that there is someone could do that.
I'm not sure my question, I guess I'll ask it anyway. I like that last answer, so I was just going to absorb that for a second.
We have to be kind, so you can ask anything.
Well, now I have sort of two questions.
Oh.
Or maybe one initial comment is I find it helpful, and I don't know if this makes sense, when you think about bodhicitta and doing things for others, it can add some juice for me to include myself, right? Like in the four immeasurables, to start with yourself, the Tonglen, start with yourself. So it's not so much about my benefit, but that identification with others is helpful. My question, though, was I've been reading Buddhism with an Attitude again, Alan Wallace. And every time I read Alan Wallace, it reminds me of a lot of instructions that I've gotten over time about sort of achieving quiescence, achieving shamatha, and a lot of discussion of insight practice in the context of you're not really going to make a lot of progress on this unless you've got some pretty deep quiescence, shamatha, calm.
Yeah.
And for somebody who is still a long way from accomplishing shamatha and doesn't have a lot of time to get there, my question was, how do I read those kinds of instructions in some kind of positive way and not in a discouraging way?
That's a great question. That is really important. I am not sure that I know anybody who hasn't lived in that space that you're talking about. How do I even just take the next breath in this thing that won't work? and to some degree, the issue arises because we would like to not encourage ourselves and others to have unrealistic expectations. And since we all have had unrealistic expectations, we know the outcome of that one really well. But that isn't good enough. And what you just said is a great example of that. Like, we can put our expectations aside and do all sorts of things, but at some point along the way, we have to have confidence. So where does that confidence come from? Normally, it comes from some level of success, right? If we just keep going at it and we keep hearing, and I don't mean this as a cut on Alan at all, I mean, but his specialty is shamatha, above all else, at least that has been my experience. And I wouldn't necessarily rely strictly also upon just his comments. Like, you also might find some help in other texts that take a slightly different approach. Sometimes, you know, the batteries in one flashlight go out. You need to get another one and look at it in a slightly different way. For example, when we practice shamatha, I can say that probably in the last 30 years, at least 29 of them, the success was measured by how still your mind was in the practice of shamatha, and whether or not you could remain in that state for a certain period of time. And along the way, about maybe 10 years ago, without going into this too far, I just want to say, maybe about 10 years ago, I was talking with a teacher who many of us know, but I don't want to go into that right now. And the instruction, because I was basically saying the same thing, the problem we have here, not only with myself sitting in front of this person, but also the people who we're supposed to be helping to learn these things, we're somehow inadvertently undermining the very thing we're trying to deliver sometimes. And there's lots of examples of that, but it's not intentional. What we need in order for this to work is we have to have confidence. Confidence, many teachers will say, is the absolute requirement. Like, you have no confidence, you got nothing. It isn't going to go anywhere. So anyone who's consistently practicing has certainly got some level of confidence at some level. But if it doesn't grow a bit, we lose that thing. It's not some like permanent thing, like you get it and now you have that thing. It has to keep renewing itself somehow. So the instruction that I got was very interesting, and I don't necessarily recommend it for everybody, but I'll just give it to you anyway, and you can do with it what you want. And that is that shamatha is not necessarily in all contexts just to be defined as the stillness of the mind, the stillness of it. So the instruction that I got was, under what circumstances would it be helpful to merely be aware of what is going on with your mind as opposed to what you already know? What's it like to still the mind, which is kind of like, one is sort of putting the brake on, and the other one is just taking your foot off the gas. What if you just took the content of your busy mind as the object of your awareness? So now the judgment which is implied about the busy mind and meditation are two separate things. They just don't relate somehow. If your mind is busy, then you're not doing shamatha. Well, it's still true, even if you take the busy mind, because you've got to be still at somewhere seeing the busy mind. Otherwise, you're probably just being swept away by the current again. But the busy mind is easy to find. It's like we have that almost all the time. And I have personally found it in the long run not particularly helpful to think of it as the enemy. For one thing, it always seems to me like, just in the common vernacular, I feel outgunned every time. Every time. Like I just don't have the tools for it. And it seems to always have the tools to deal with me. It's unfair. Yeah. So to actually take what is really an authentic approach, this is not like something just somebody made up. If you look for it, you can find it. That you can take the content of your regular, ordinary experience and just put your awareness on that experience. So just to kind of say a couple of things about this quickly. It won't work if you try to manage everything that your mind can be experiencing at any given moment. You know, it's like you're playing catch with somebody throwing a ball back and forth. It works unless somebody throws 100 balls at once, in which case you don't have a chance. And we throw 100 balls at once at ourselves on a regular basis. So what we have to do is we have to step back from it and decide exactly what am I going to pay attention to as the practice. So it might be your utter disappointment in being able to just settle the mind in the ordinary way that we ordinarily practice shamatha. So we feel disappointed, like I've been doing this for how long and it's still like this. You can get one thing out of there that you can put your awareness on, and it's likely to be an emotion. I hate this. When am I ever going to get something out of this? And you might at some point actually find that you can look at that disappointment. The more you look at the disappointment, clearly look at it, you could find that the disappointment gets less, but then the mind gets busy again. So you're into a game here where the disappointment itself needs to be increased. In other words, we're trying to avoid the disappointment when actually when you've isolated it, it's the fuel. That's the experience that you need. It's easy to flatten our experiences. We do that all the time. It's just not helpful. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to become intimate with ourselves. And we mix that up with trying to change ourselves before we've been intimate enough with ourselves to know what a positive change would even look like. So when we sit down and you do the meditation, embrace the disappointment first, because you got to make friends with it. You have to make friends with it. And if the game is all about just having a still mind, you're never going to make friends with it. And the mind is not going to get still. So pick something like an emotion is a great thing. Like, let's say you've had an argument with somebody. And let's, for the sake of courtesy to ourselves, it wasn't a big argument, but I'm still feeling a little disappointed. Sit down and look at that disappointment. Don't try to fix it. It's kind of like honor it. You know, I'm alive. I'm alive and I have relationships with people. And so here I am just looking at a piece of a relationship. And you're also practicing the meditation. And I think I can say from my own self, just honestly, I've found that to be a helpful approach just put my awareness on the mental state rather than the content of the mind. And then sometimes I also feel like it's still like swirling back there like a hurricane, but it's okay because it's back there. And I can feel the wind on my back, but it actually doesn't have any authority. It's just there. So in that way, I think it's worth running the experiment to see if you can take something out of your experience and use that as your focus of attention for shamatha. And I know for sure you'll find it most helpful if what you focus on has some power. Like an emotion is a great example, because that's what we mean by an emotion, is it's an experience that has some power. It doesn't have to be negative. It could be totally joyful. Okay, I think we've burned ourselves out here. So, may I quickly realize Ahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Thank you all for coming. That was delightful. Delightful experience.
Okay, so we're not supposed to
Hi, Robert.
applaud.
Hi, Robert.
Hi.
Nice to see you. How are you?